De Soto and various others observed many decades ago, as we know, that places are being made and remade all the time by different people, for different people. This idea of place making is like the creative city. It's one of those terms that invokes broadly positive images while being recruited to a very wide range of agendas. It means so many things, maybe it means nothing, which is perhaps why it's generated an industry of people travelling the world telling us how to do it. Just as the creative city had Franco Bianchini and Charles Landry, John Montgomery, Richard Florida, collecting six-figure sums to tell hapless city governments how they too can become creative. Placemaking has its own jet-setting industry trading on the idea. Well, I travel the world too, and I say it's all bullshit. But I'm not paid so well. In general terms, placemaking refers to the activity of giving meaning or coherence to a locale. It can draw attention to the practices of daily engagement in a place, to highlight the processes by which meanings of various kinds come to be associated with places of various kinds. It can have community development objectives, acted out through shared arts activities, for example. It can be employed in the interests of inclusive cultural planning, as Wendy Sarkisian does. It can refer to the intent to revamp and re-envision underperforming public spaces, as Ethan Kent would tell us. It can be used to brand destinations, as the UTS Business School says, or be tied into place promotion and advertising and impose themed designs onto precincts such as Chinatowns. It can stereotype places and their inhabitants and contribute to displacement. Placemaking can be formal, led by governments, developers and community groups, or informal, people using spaces in whatever way to suit themselves, make it work for them. Now, both types have results that can be interpreted as positive or negative, depending on who's doing the interpreting. I think all places have some sense of place. It's interesting to read John Friedman in his piece in 2010 on the banlieues in Paris, this the placelessness that he describes. And I want to read an extract that he's actually quoting a novelist, Leclésio, when he's talking about the banlieues. He says, they look like an abandoned town. Perhaps there is really no one here. No one in the tall grey buildings with the thousands of rectangular windows, no one in the stairwells, in the elevators, and still no one in the great parking lots where the cars are parked. Perhaps all the doors and windows have been bricked up, blinded, and no one can escape from within the walls, the apartments, the basements. And yet, aren't the people moving around between the great grey walls, the men, the women, the children, even the dogs occasionally, rather like shadowless ghosts, disembodied, intangible, blank-eyed beings lost in lifeless space, and they can never meet one another, as if they had no names. Well, they do have names, and they do meet each other. And it's true also that the sunny third-floor landing in a block of flats becomes a safe and pleasant place for people who've scored locally to shoot up and lie around for a while before they have to leave. They can see from the building window there on the landing who's coming in. It may not be so pleasant for the residents of the building, but it's not placeless. Airports, the other exemplar of the concept of placelessness, are now anything but, at least to Melbourne and LA and Denpasar, some airports that I have been frequenting recently. All sorts of things go on there. Different patterns over the 24-hour night cycle, all day or night. Their work and social centres, they act as meeting places for people all over a continent to fly in, meet face-to-face and fly out. They don't leave the airport these days. Some extraordinary meetings happen there, particularly in those, the Chairman's Lounge. Do we know the Chairman's Lounge? That's where actually all of the serious decisions around the world apparently get made. I haven't been in there. These occurrences aren't happening in a vacuum. With their freely accessible washing facilities, they're increasingly becoming suitable places for temporary and transient and ambiguously homeless populations, particularly in Denpasar and LA. they're far from placeless. And in some ways, they remind me of the bridge in William Gibson's Virtual Light, you know, this sort of build-up of accretions on and on and on that nobody planned and nobody anticipated. My colleague, Ruth Fincher, and I showed a few years ago in our work on tertiary students in Melbourne that there are at least two particular kinds of informal placemaking going on in the central city. And with a master's student, I've recently written a paper on formal practices of placemaking in Melbourne. These two can have quite different outcomes. Work that Ruth and I and another colleague, Marie Pardee, are doing looks at the idea of place masking, where placemaking is a mask for development business as usual, for the everyday political economy of the entrepreneurial city. But formal practices vary radically as well. So a second way of slicing this concept employs the notion of use value and exchange value. And it is here that we can become a little bit more normative in our assessments, perhaps. Assessments can be made in the question of who are these places for. And this often relates to the use and display of power. Whose power, over whom, exercised to what ends, who is excluded, and why. Okay, so I think it's useful to examine placemaking practices in terms of their emphasis on and contribution to use value, the value gained simply from using a place, and its exchange value, the value gained from a commercial transaction on its component parts. So let's start with informal practices. And first, we'll look at those at privilege exchange. So the student housing that Ruth and I were looking at, that was built between Melbourne Uni and RMIT in the late 1990s and early 2000s. I don't know if any of you know Melbourne, but that sort of central spine of Swanston Street that goes up towards Carlton is now a pretty much wall-to-wall series of largely 10-storey buildings, all of which are international student housing. It was in response to the dramatic increase in international student enrolments in that time, and it was relatively unregulated. The private sector is more nimble than governments and universities universities clearly didn't anticipate the response to their advertising campaign to increase funding. And so institutional housing providers, student housing providers, began building what worked for them and their investors, who are a very important component of the student housing arrangement. So the buildings that were built are very high density, like I said, 10 stories pretty much uniformly, although there's a bit more variation in this one. No common space in any of the buildings. Very little socialising space. Tiny rooms. And this is largely for ease of management and therefore sale, which is, of course, how these buildings are funded. So they send their residents out into the wider world to eat and socialise, and that's okay. That's one form of placemaking, such as it is. A second form is an informal practice, young people doing it for themselves. So there are a couple of, you probably can't see this, there's a beautiful little bar that's just sort of popped up in a vacant space, operates out of a couple of shipping containers, and students and young people have decorated it themselves. They have little parties there, there's artwork, it's all, all completely informal. And council is kind of recognises it and lets it go. They had to get a liquor licence. Again, students just making their own places. I don't know if you can see all of the artwork in the window here, but this is a fantastic little bar, St Jerome's. The community around this bar is involved in producing a lot of street art. They produce a festival, a St Jerome's music festival once a year, but there's always music and stuff going on there. More street art in the lanes. So the students and young people here are getting very productive, very active. They're engaging in their own way in the centre of Melbourne and producing, again, their own places entirely informally. So now to the formal practices. Melbourne's laneways are famous, of course. There are different kinds of laneways, I think. There's a very conscious strategy and the ones that I'm going to show you here, the differences between informal and formal in Melbourne's laneways is very light. It's largely to do with use and activity. And of course, the uses and activities in these laneways are formalised. And it's as much about the use as the form. So the wonderful Rob Adams in the City Design Unit at the City of Melbourne influenced the tendencies and activities that go on there as much as the actual design. The design interventions are actually very light. But the land uses are very particularly social. And people flock there. There's commerce and consumption here, indeed. There's no lack of exchange, but the emphasis is on the use. The businesses may exchange, and the ambience certainly does not decrease their exchange value. But people are there for the place, for the pleasure of being there. The State Library forecourt, now I have to say I took this photo yesterday when it was absolutely freezing in Melbourne and raining. It was 16 degrees and then it was 37 here, ridiculous. I just realised yesterday that I don't have a picture of the State Library forecourt in my library, so I had to rush out with my camera. So it's wet, and so there aren't people sitting around, but I can assure you that this is one of the most used spaces in Melbourne. People absolutely flock there at any time of day, particularly when it's warm. And they do so largely because, and it's pretty simple, and the City of Melbourne placemakers understand it well, the steps, the seats, grass and a few trees, and rubbish bins. Ethan Kent would charge you a lot of money to hear that. Exchange value, well, formal practices of placemaking that emphasise exchange value are probably the ones that most of us are most accustomed to and certainly talk about the most. Developer and government-led placemaking through planning and urban design objectives, in my mind, almost invariably fails. This is QV, the Grocon redevelopment in the central city, the redevelopment of the Queen Victoria Hospital site. The design objectives were very good, and they involved retaining one of the old heritage listed structures, only one that you can see here in the sunlight. This has been converted into the Victorian Women's Centre as a recognition of the role of the hospital. It was intended as a lovely social space, and in fact it is well used inside the building, and it was intended that the building that you can see to the left in the slide was to be stepped back from that so that it kept it in sun. BHP Billiton was the tenant and decided that it needed a lot more space than it had originally thought. So it turned into a great huge slab, which was not originally intended in the placemaking framework. So it results in the central public square being profoundly subjected to commercial interests, not just by the BHP building, but the buildings surrounding it. So there's hardly any sun. You can see there's like a couple of students sitting trying to get a little bit of sun there, but it's very, very poorly used. The laneway, this is a laneway in the QV development. Now, interestingly, the city actually wanted control of the laneway. Rob Adams thought that was an important aspect, and I agree with him. The developer disagreed and wanted to retain control, largely because of economic reasons. And so they've filled the laneways largely with franchises and larger businesses, which are indeed economically successful, but as a place they don't work. The effect of the BHP building is not just on on that development itself. This is Lonsdale Street and the nominal Greek precinct. All of that also isn't place-made. That just generated organically, informally. Stalactites is the famous Greek restaurant on the corner in the sun, and the Greek precinct used to go all the way down that street, and there were still shops there and cafes, but they had to put up wind barriers because of the wind tunnel. And most of the time that whole street is now in shadow. So the Greek precinct has been pretty much decimated. So the effect is not just on the development itself. Internally, QV, Melbourne Central, and quite a lot of Melbourne's other shopping malls in the city centre, are the kind of the formal corollary of the informal institutional practices building the student housing. For those students who are too timid to make their own places, these provide safe, surveilled consumption spaces, and indeed they have a place, they are a place. But it's safe to say that those places where the emphasis is on use as opposed to exchange are overall much more interesting and engaging places to be, depending on who you are. But even when the emphasis is squarely on use, formal practices don't always get it right. This is in part because of the tendency for placemakers and urban designers to maintain the fiction that they can design places for everyone. This is Federation Square. Again, wet. I'm sorry about that. I took the photo yesterday. But again, it's actually a very successful space, largely because of the steps and the stairs. Again, people can sit there. They work a treat. Put in some stairs. But it's not a place for the disabled. It's not a place for the homeless. There are private security guards engaged by Fed Square management, and young people are discouraged from loitering or hanging around. It's good for the well-behaved middle class. Lincoln Square is a park in Carlton, and this is possibly one of the most fascinating mixes of formal and informal placemaking that I've seen. It started, this memorial, as a memorial to the Bali bombings in 2002 in an otherwise unremarkable park. And it's used one day a year on the 12th of October, tomorrow in fact, for that purpose, as a memorial. The rest of the year round was colonised by skateboarders. And I don't know if you can see the no skateboarding sign in the middle there, on the bottom right. I love it. The skateboarders have actually built a real place there. It's a fantastic skateboard place, but also there's a lot of kids that hang around there and have a great time. And you know, I work near there, and they're good kids. They've completely taken over the memorial, so everybody who's walking through the park walks around that bit, which they can do. It's not a big deal. One day a year, which just happened to be yesterday, in the rain, the graffiti removal vans and the council workmen come along and try to kind of sand off the damage that's been done to the memorial by the skateboards, so that tomorrow, when the families of the victims in the Bali bombing come here, it'll look nice and clean. And then presumably next week it'll go back to its original purpose, well, its other main purpose. Next week the kids will be back. So it is what it is. And maybe all these unintended consequences are okay. People adapt in their own ways, and the unpredictability could be a part of the appeal. But perhaps we want to shape a place for this or that, for this use or that. Maybe a more productive than consumptive activity, for example. So, to the extent that placemaking is or should be a practice to take seriously, careful thought needs to go into a few fundamentals, such as, what is the intent? Is it for the use, or is it for maintaining the value of the land? Who's it for? Is it for the corporates in the suits? If so, build another docklands. Identifying existing and prospective user groups in the process can be a very enlightening task. The question that has to be asked first is why? Why do we want to create yet another place for the well-behaved middle class? Why do we want to accommodate vagrants? If you want kids buying stuff, build QV. Because what we do as placemakers has an effect, just not ones we're after, more often than not. But placemaking with the well-behaved middle class in mind, I think, does need to be challenged. They have their run of the city pretty well. They can go anywhere, even places they're not supposed to. So the question of for whom is one that forces analysis of motives and matters of equity. And what about those with not much place? that makes a third procedural matter come into play. How to do it? Well, you have to create the conditions, and you have to care. So this may not be the most endearing slide of Sydney, but it's the street on which I banged into one of the lead architects of Lend-Lease on the Barangaroo development after interviewing him earlier that day. This was a couple of months ago. Ran into him barrelling out of the art shop there with a small bag from a nearby bookshop. And I said to you, I said, what are you doing here? And he said, I love this part of the city. I had a little bit of time. He said, I love the fine grain. I love the urbanity. And he accompanied me to my destination, which was to meet some musos who were members of the Live Music Task Force, the City of Sydney's Live Music Task Force, which I was up for the day. So he walked me through to Mojo Record and Bar, which is a little record shop in front and a bar behind, and he loved it. He went crazy for it. He didn't know it existed. Tiny little space downstairs. You can't even see it from the street. And I said to him, where are all the small shops in Barangaroo? The bookshops and the record bars and the creative spaces and the room for startups and co-ops and non-profits in the hubs that they're becoming accustomed to. And for that matter, the industrial uses and social housing and social centres that should invariably accompany those. Where are these in Barangaroo? And he said, oh, they won't be able to afford the rents. So maybe we can talk about that. Thank you.